All right, so today we're diving deep into post-colonial Africa, specifically the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, formed in 1963. Now, you might be more familiar with the African Union today, but going back to the OAU, it's like a time machine back to this huge moment of hope, but also intense struggle, and honestly, some pretty head-scratching contradictions.
Yeah, it was a pivotal moment for sure. I mean, picture this, a whole continent throwing off centuries of colonial rule, 32 brand new nations, each with their own idea of what the future holds, coming together with this burning desire for unity and self-determination. That energy, that's what gave birth to the OAU in Addis Ababa on May 25th, 1963.
It sounds almost utopian, like this collective dream of shaking off colonialism and rising together. Right, but then you start digging a little and you keep bumping into this phrase, the Dictators Club. How does an organization with such big goals end up with a nickname like that?
Well, that's where you hit the OAU's, you could say, inherent tension. See, they were all about unity, solidarity, but at the same time, they had this very strict policy, non-interference, they called it. Basically, hands-off when it came to what was happening inside each member state.
Okay, hold on. On the one hand, yeah, respecting each nation's sovereignty, that makes sense, right? But on the other hand, wasn't that kind of a convenient way to just ignore some really messed up situations? Like Idi Amin's reign of terror in Uganda? The OAU couldn't do anything, even with all the horrific human rights abuses.
You're getting at a crucial point. Their hands were pretty much tied by this non-interference policy. Now, you got to remember the context, too. The Cold War was in full swing, and Africa became this battleground between the U.S. and the USSR, each vying for influence. So some OAU leaders argued, look, prioritizing stability, even under an authoritarian leader, it's the lesser of two evils. They were afraid that stepping in would just cause more chaos, more meddling from outside.
That's kind of a chilling thought, though, isn't it? Like, as long as the oppression stays within a country's borders, it's fine. Did no one within the OAU push back against that?
Definitely, there were dissenting voices. Some argued, look, you can't have true unity if you ignore tyranny. But this was also the peak of Pan-Africanism, the idea of unifying all people of African descent. It was a powerful idea. And figures like Kwame Nkrumah, he was a huge advocate for Pan-Africanism. He saw the OAU as the way to get there. And he believed that unity, even with these compromises, was essential to stand up to all those outside pressures.
So it sounds like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, caught between this vision of a united Africa and then the realities of power and politics, the nitty-gritty. Makes you wonder, could they even have functioned without that non-interference policy? Would the whole thing have just fallen apart from all the internal arguments?
That's the million-dollar question. Historians are still debating it. Some say the OAU was destined to be a dictators club from day one, that its very structure made those abuses possible. Others say it was the only way to move forward at the time. A flawed step, yeah, but a crucial one on the long road to a truly united Africa. And it's fascinating to see how this tension played out. Like, take the OAU's role in ending colonialism and white minority rule, for example.
Right, because even with all this internal struggle, they were racking up some major wins on that front. They weren't just talking about unity. They were actively backing liberation movements.
Exactly. They provided weapons, training, bases, the whole 9 yards to groups fighting for independence. And what's crucial is they used their combined power at the UN to isolate South Africa, put huge pressure on the apartheid regime. That's a concrete example of the OAU flexing its muscles on the world stage and making real change.
So it's like they were running on two tracks at the same time. Internally, wrestling with this non-interference thing, and externally, fighting like hell against colonialism. Makes those achievements against apartheid even more impressive, given everything else going on.
Absolutely. And it went beyond just fighting colonialism. The OAU knew that real independence needed more than just political freedom. They saw how African nations were still economically tied to their former rulers, stuck in this web of neo-colonialism. So they did something about it. One of their biggest legacies is establishing the African Development Bank back in 1964.
Ah, yes. The AFDB, as it's known today. That's huge, right? It was specifically designed to boost economic growth and cut that reliance on former powers, wasn't it?
Exactly. It was a way for African nations to pool their resources, invest in their own development, and break free from those, you could say, invisible chains of economic dependence. But even with the AFDB, challenges remained. Many nations still needed aid. And guess who was usually holding the purse strings?
The former colonizers, right? Or in some cases, the U.S. or the USSR, each trying to pull these countries into their Cold War camp. It sounds like a constant tightrope walk for these newly independent nations. Anything specific from the sources that really stood out to you as an example of this neo-colonialism in action?
Well, one that struck me was how some former French colonies, who were still very much tied to France, economically and politically, they formed what was called the Monrovia Group within the OAU. They were more moderate, you could say, and they often clashed with the more radical factions who wanted a complete break from any Western influence.
Wait, so you're saying there were divisions within the OAU based on these old colonial relationships?
Yeah, and that wasn't the only dividing line. The Cold War ideology played a part too. You had Ghana, under Nkrumah, leaning toward socialism, while places like the Ivory Coast were more pro-capitalist, aligning with the West.
So you've got these internal divisions based on Cold War allegiances, former colonial ties, and differing ideas about the future of Africa itself. It really paints a different picture from that first image, right?
Yeah.
32 nations united in this grand Pan-African dream.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how they got anything done at all.
And that's exactly what we'll unpack after a quick break. We'll look at how these internal divisions, coupled with all that pressure from the outside world, ultimately shaped where the OAU went and why it eventually disbanded.
It's wild how those divisions you talked about played out while they were dealing with all that external stuff too. Like they were juggling like 5 crises at once.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It got heated. I mean, there were walkouts, threats of countries just quitting the OAU entirely. Like in 65, when Nkrumah, the guy from Ghana, he hosted an OAU summit in Accra. And the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Some delegations just straight up boycotted the whole thing. They said Nkrumah was trying to push his socialist agenda, undermine their sovereignty, all that.
So basically, the very thing they were aiming for, unity, was constantly being challenged by these big ideological and political rifts.
Yeah.
Did these divisions ever actually stop them from taking action when it really mattered?
Sadly, yeah. A prime example is the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War. That was a brutal one from 1967 to 1970. The OAU was completely split down the middle on how to handle it. Some member states backed the Nigerian government, while others, like Tanzania and Zambia, they recognized the breakaway Republic of Biafra. So no consensus, which meant the OAU was basically useless in terms of mediating the conflict, and it ended up being a humanitarian catastrophe. Just awful.
It's just tragic. Sounds like their own internal struggles totally prevented them from being a force for peace in Africa.
Yeah, it is kind of ironic. United against colonialism, but when it came to conflicts within Africa, those deep divisions often paralyzed them. And then as the Cold War ramped up, those divisions just got worse, undermining their effectiveness even further.
It makes you think. Even when everyone's on board with the big picture goal, actually finding common ground is incredibly hard, especially when you've got these powerful external forces pulling in different directions, right?
It's exactly like that. Imagine trying to build a house on a foundation that's constantly shifting beneath you. But even with those challenges, even with that dictators club label hanging over them, we have to acknowledge the OAU did leave a lasting impact. It wasn't all bad.
You're right. We've been focusing on the struggles, but what about the stuff that really stuck? How did their experiences, the good and the bad, help pave the way for the African Union? Yeah. The one that replaced the OAU in 2002.
Well, I think the most important thing the OAU did was simply exist. I mean, think about it. For the first time in modern history, you had an organization that brought all the independent nations of Africa together under one banner. Just that in itself, that was a powerful symbol of unity, of self-determination.
It basically made Pan-Africanism real, something tangible, not just an idea.
Exactly. And even though they weren't always successful, their efforts to mediate conflicts, to work together economically, to present a united front on the global stage, it set a precedent, showed that African nations could and should work together to solve their problems.
And it wasn't just symbolic. They created institutions that are still around today, like the African Development Bank, right? The one we talked about earlier. It's still making a huge difference in terms of economic development all over the continent.
Yeah, and that continued success is a testament to the OAU's vision. They knew that true independence meant economic empowerment, too. The African Development Bank, it was a real concrete step in that direction. And they also laid the groundwork for other important institutions, like the African Court on Human and People's Rights. That was established under the African Union, the AU. And it's a big deal because it's playing a crucial role in upholding human rights across Africa now.
That's a huge shift from the OAU's hands-off approach, isn't it? It seems like the AU really learned from the OAU's mistakes, and they decided to be a lot more proactive about human rights.
They did. The AU's founding charter, it straight up rejects unconditional sovereignty. It says, right there, that the Union has the right to intervene if a member state is committing genocide, or crimes against humanity, or serious human rights violations. That's them directly responding to the criticisms the OAU faced.
It definitely seems like they wanted to make sure those mistakes weren't repeated. Did they also make any changes to the way the organization was structured, to try and address those internal divisions that caused so many problems for the OAU?
They definitely did. The AU, they went with a much more robust system of governance, rotating presidency, stronger emphasis on representing different regions, and they also created the Pan-African Parliament, which is meant to give a voice to everyday African citizens and build a sense of shared identity that goes beyond national borders.
So they were really aiming for a more integrated and democratic Africa, politically and economically. It's amazing to see how they built on what the OAU started while also trying to fix its weaknesses. But I am curious about how that transition actually went down from the OAU to the AU. Was it a smooth handoff?
Well, seamless might not be the right word. Remember, the OAU was born in a very different time. Cold War still raging, colonialism a recent memory. But by the late 90s, the world had changed a lot. Cold War was over, apartheid had fallen, a whole new generation of African leaders were in charge. And they realized that the OAU, with its outdated structures and all the baggage it carried, it just wasn't equipped to handle the challenges of the 21st century.
So they basically said, time for a reboot.
Pretty much, yeah. There was this growing feeling that Africa needed something new, something more dynamic, an organization that could actually tackle things like poverty, conflict, globalization, all those big issues.